Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This radio program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. Muffin Talk is a weekly radio program to which I invite guests to talk about their work and their passion for issues on community programs, social justice, Bible studies, or the Catholic Church. Today, I have invited Professor Thomas O'Loughlin to a Zoom recording for a broadcast. Tom, a warm welcome and hi to our radio program.
Thank you. It's lovely to be with you.
Professor Thomas O'Loughlin is originally from Dublin, Ireland. He is an ordained priest and emeritus professor of historical theology at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He has visited New Zealand several times and has given many presentations on different topics in the area of liturgy. Tom, recently we've heard a lot about the role of women in the church. Pope Francis has announced his intention to appoint 2 women to the dicastery of bishops, who will therefore be involved in the process of choosing new bishops. Last week, we celebrated the newly introduced feast day of Mary Magdalene, and in a couple of weeks, we will celebrate the feast day of the Assumption of Mary, the feast to which Bishop Pompallier dedicated Aotearoa, New Zealand. What do we know about the women and the role of the women in Jesus' time?
One of the most difficult differences between ancient societies in general and Judaism, which is the one we're concerned with, and today, is regarding the role of women. Let's start with how we see women. Imagine a father coming out of a maternity hospital and he says, "Hooray, my wife has just given birth. We have a lovely baby girl. We're going to call it Beata." And he meets his friend, his good friend, the guy he goes to the pub with every day. And he expects his friend to take out the proverbial cigar and offer it to him and say, "Congratulations." What if the friend said to him, "Oh dear, you have my sympathy. Another girl." And you would express your sympathy at this. A couple of years ago, I met a Catholic who was deeply involved in trying to stop anyone discussing the idea of the ordination of women, because this was just wrong. And I saw that waiting at the back of the hall was his wife and 3 daughters. And he'd been giving out to me after a lecture I gave. It actually occurred in Christchurch. And I said, "Oh, you must introduce me to your wife." Because I've been teaching in universities and you can always tell students, you just know students when you see them, you know. And "Oh, yes, and he introduced me to his wife and he introduced me to the 3 daughters. And I said, "What do your daughters do?" And one was studying medicine. One had been in America studying something technical as well. And one also was just about to go off to study law. And I said, "Have you any sons?" And he said, yes, he had 1 son. And he was away at another university and he also was studying law. I said, "I notice you assume that they're entitled to the same level of education. So they must actually be equal in your eyes." I said, "Isn't it interesting? No one in the ancient world would have dreamt of that." And there's a very simple way of seeing that difference. When we read the Gospels, we realize that Jesus had brothers and sisters. We know the names of his 4 brothers, we're just told they're named. They're named in several of the Gospels. And leave aside sort of old-fashioned things like trying to pretend that they're not really brothers or not. The important point is that the brothers are named, and also his sisters. So you name men, and you just talk about the sisters.
Mm.
You name a group, and then you say, and the women. And you will find this. He was followed by these named people, some other men, and the women. When we look at 2 sets of documents, they're from different branches of Judaism, but they help us to get the flavor. We don't know enough about the Judaism of Galilee, which gives rise to the Jesus movement. But when we look at the Judaism down in the Qumran community, we find that women, even though they can take a central part in the cult, according to Philo, in their own documents, they presuppose that the principal reality of women is that they can bring impurity into the household, into the community, and into the community's worship. Women are a source of impurity. When we look at the development in the 2nd century, the Mishnah, one of the tracts is relating to women, men. It's called Men and Women, and the reason it's framed as men and women because men are the members of the household of Israel, and women exist in relation to them. So you actually focus on men, and women come in quite literally as an appendix.
What if there are no men in the household?
Well, you see, there are men and women in the household, but it is the man who is the focus. The male is the focus. It is the male who has sworn the covenant with the Lord. It is the community of men who have sworn the covenant with the Lord. And the women come in through their association with men.
Mm-hmm.
It's very much like the old-fashioned invitations. You are, the Right Honourable such and such is invited to dinner with his wife. She's only brought along because she's associated with him. She's not brought in her own.
That is like in olden times, even the women were given the titles of the men because they didn't assume that she would have acquired the title herself.
Yes, yes. Now, that is the major difference. So the problem for Christianity is we are in a situation where our sources, the early documents, whether they're canonical as in the Gospels or non-canonical as in other writings of the early Christians, were produced in one culture where a woman is saved through her husband. And now we're in a society where we assume that when a child is born, whether it's male or female, we should be equally joyful. And we would never dream of saying a prayer, I thank you, Lord, that you have made me a man and therefore capable of all that a man can do. And we certainly wouldn't go up to that person coming out of the maternity hospital and say, oh, you poor fellow, and only a girl. Only a girl. Now, you see, we in the Catholic Church, and to a certain extent in many Christian churches, but certainly in the Catholic Church, and certainly in many of the fundamentalist churches, which insist on only males can lead. What is happening is that there is the reality of what we actually experience today. And we don't just say we believe, we actually somehow know that men and women are to be treated equally. And you're supposed to love your daughter as much as your son. And a woman is to have the same rights to education as a man. And they're key markers in our society because they're markers about the small scale of value. You know, don't tell me you don't say, I have Tom, Dick, and Harry, and several daughters. You don't say that now. You don't say, all the money will go to educate the boys, and the girls, they can just go off and get married. Now, you see, in that culture, the boys do a function, the girls just get married. Their achievement is to be linked to a man. So that's the culture we live in. We don't accept that. We believe that men and women have equal dignity and equal aspirations and equal worth. Now, notice I haven't used the word rights. Mm-hmm. Rights is a legal idea, and arguing about equal rights it's fun for politicians. But when I hear bishops doing it, I really feel, oh God, I wish they would go and read what's happening and think about it. The issue of the reason why people are discussing women's ordination is not a matter of equal rights. It's because we live in a society of equal worth, equal aspiration, and equal dignity. If you're already in that thing, you cannot but ask questions about exclusions on the basis of sex. So leave the rights issue is just a fudge. Mm. Now, if you go into the world of the New Testament, it's completely other. For Catholics, we have difficulty in accepting the new because we have the idea that the new must somehow accord with the old. And for fundamentalists, the new must somehow accord with a magical time when this so-called document called the New Testament was created. But the problem is, for the Catholics, the new always is where we have to preach, because the old is the world moves on. And for the fundamentalists, you can't treat a collection of writings that were produced for the moment and then codified in the 3rd and 4th century and treat them as if they're a blueprint, because our ancient sources are inspiration, not ground plan.
And you need to see it in the context always.
Oh, always. But you see, now if we start looking at the way stories of women are told in those ancient, and let's concentrate on the canonical texts, the so-called New Testament, this collection, you find that the women's stories, every time a woman comes into the story, it's told in relationship to how she associates with a man. And Mary is told because she will do the Lord's bidding. And because she will do the Lord's bidding, she can have a different relationship to Joseph in his bidding. The woman at the well becomes someone who comes up because she tells us something about Jesus. It doesn't tell us about her, but even she is identified by the fact that I have no husband. Ah, but you've had several husbands. So again, she's identified not in herself, but in relationship to what she does to men, and insofar as she helps to understand the message of the man Jesus.
What about Mary and Martha?
Well, Mary and Martha precisely come in because they are friends of Jesus, and they serve him. They come in as accidental. They're accidental players. There is no story in the New Testament that's focused on a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And they come in as accidental players. And so that would not have bothered any of the storytellers, because they're not telling the story of those women. They're telling the story of Jesus. That's their aim. They want to tell the story of Jesus. And so everyone, to a certain extent, comes in as a bit player in the surroundings. But notice that the women come in as almost accidental bit players. And the most curious thing of all is how few women are named. For instance, Jesus heals Jairus' daughter.
Mm-hmm.
We're told Jairus' name because he's important. We're not told the daughter's name. Jesus has his feet washed by a woman, and there is one of the statements that this will be remembered. This will be remembered, and people will praise her for what she has done. And she'll be remembered for what she has done. But it's for what she has done. They won't remember her because we don't know her name. When we look at the image of Pentecost, we're told that the disciples were all together. The 12 are named, and they're together with Mary and the other women. So Mary is the great exception because she takes over lots of other functions, and in many ways is not a good example of how women are viewed in Christian tradition, because she is the woman who is in a way wholly exceptional. And the wholly exception, the more Mary is wholly exceptional, the less she can be the typical.
And even she was not named in all the Gospels.
Well, exactly, but the interesting one is, think about the picture of Pentecost. Many people watching your video will have an image of this. 12 disciples, Mary in the middle, the flame, 13 little flames. And the problem is, where are all the other women? The text actually says, and there were other women there. So you could put in another half dozen women and flames on their head. Can you show me a picture that's like that? And that gives you an idea of how they're in the background. They're in the background.
Is that something that has to do with the culture, maybe? Because a few years ago, I interviewed a Bible scholar who used to live in the Middle East, and she said that the people never called her by her name. They always said she's the wife of so-and-so.
Oh, of course it's culture. One of the most important aspects of any human culture is how men and women relate to one another. Mm. It's how men and women relate. How do we form units? How do we form families? Is it monogamy? Is it polygamy? Is it polyandry? Is it a communal house? Is it individual houses? Is it one of these extended families with an old great grandparent and everyone in? So how men and women relate is at the very center of culture. And the reason, you can go back through 1800 years of biblical exegesis by Christians. Let's just by Christians. And no one raises the question of the place of women in society. No one raises the question of how women relate to Jesus, with the exception of Mary. Mary is always the exception. But no one raises that question because the relationship of men and women in society was itself unquestioned.
In the scholarship of men.
In the scholarship of men. You will hardly find, if you could find in that 1800 years, half a dozen women writers that were taken seriously, you would be doing well. In fact, I don't think you would find half a dozen women. Until 1850, I doubt if you would find half a dozen serious women exegetes. Mm-hmm. Today, you go into any theology classroom, 50, if not 60% of the students will be women, but that varies with cultures. I've been in classrooms where women are still the exception. Mm-hmm. I've taught in seminaries where there are no women, and it's interesting to give a lecture in a secular university where there's 60% women, and then to give the exact same lecture a week later in a seminary where they're all young men. Completely different questions come up. And you say to them, you know, the questions you ask are not the questions you'll be asked by women in a parish who come up to you after you preach this on Sunday. And the guys don't understand that.
You might have to bring them together.
Our questions come from our experience.
Yeah.
So the crucial thing to take away, to keep in mind when we read something like the Gospels, is we take women seriously. The little baby girl is worth as much as the little baby boy. And we don't, we wouldn't, oh, thank God, I am a man. We couldn't pray that prayer. And yet that was a prayer that probably Jesus himself prayed, because it's an ancient Jewish prayer. It's one of the prayers that people said, because obviously it's a little bit like, I thank God that I can. I'm off. I had to fix my car recently, and I thank God that I have very good fingers for turning little nuts and fixing this thing, and that this is a gift I have. And I'm really pleased with this gift. But I don't think of my maleness as a gift. That's just it. And it was much better to be male than to be female. That's because this is our culture. But when we read the New Testament, we have to read it as it's a story about how the sons of the covenant are to be loyal to the Father and be the new Israel. And then women will link with them, and through linking with those men will become part of Israel. So a woman is only part of Israel insofar as she is properly connected to her father, to her husband, or, and this is behind the whole debate on giving the writ of divorce, if she's no longer linked to her father, the husband can give her a writ of divorce, saying, not my responsibility now, and she has to find another responsibility. And that's why, for instance, You know this famous early Christian story that gets linked into the Gospels, the woman caught in adultery. Every time that story is read in a church today, someone comes up and says, but what about the adulterous husband? Was he not? And of course, the answer is, there is no adulterous husband. She had brought impurity on Israel through her actions and therefore had to be punished. But that story is really interesting for this reason. Jesus, faced with that woman, decides that the inherited law is not going to be applied. There is a deeper understanding. Are you prepared to throw the first stone? So I'm very conscious that this program will be looked at mainly by Catholics. And I'm very conscious that Catholics have, as an institution, I know many bishops who just won't even discuss this because Rome has said that, that's the end of that, no discussion. If we're going to discuss that, we've got to stop discussing. Right? Well, the answer is, okay, but are you really going to tell all the parents in your diocese or your parish, or even your friends or your own wife or husband, that their baby girls are really not as worthwhile as their baby boys? Because if you once think they're worthwhile, this now becomes a central issue and it won't go away. Because now when people consider themselves of equal worth, anything that doesn't recognize that equal worth is itself seen as wrong. Just as, are you prepared to throw the first stone? If you're not ready to throw the first stone, then why are we doing the stoning?
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas O'Loughlin. Tom, you have raised a lot of interesting questions, and I think that's food for thought. And I think that we do need to look closer at the role of the women in the church. And Pope Francis is doing quite a lot for it, as much as he can at the moment. And on the 22nd of August, we are going to look at Mary of Nazareth, and of her different roles, and Mary, her sacred life and her human life. And this will be a presentation with Tom and with Brother Kieran Finn. And we'll look at from two different perspectives, and then we'll have some time to discuss and to talk about it and to see and have a little discussion about what people think about the different roles that Mary is playing. So thank you very much. And I'll see you then on the Zoom session on the 22nd of August, 7 to 8:30 p.m. New Zealand time. I know that you have to get up early then. Thank you very much.